pick out the right patients. And TCD provided that strategy. This is my son, actually, who helped us learn about TCD in children without hemoglobinopathy. And here he is now. And this is to show you how long this sort of thing takes. And I'm going to come back to that when I talk about a kind of a call for action for us to work together and to plan for the future. My daughter there, this is a picture of my daughter, simply to remind you, you don't need reminding, but when I show it to some audiences, what an 8-year-old should be doing, which is enjoying life. Our 8-year-old patients have much more problems, they have a painful disease, and then they also have a disease which can take their independence or even take their life, and in some cases due to stroke. So we began to work on this problem by doing a lot of TCDs, working with our colleagues. In 1992, we reported that it looked like we had a tool to pick out who was going to have the first stroke. And that's the Doppler that you heard about, and you got all of that information in previous talks, so I can go very quickly over this part. These numbers that we use, the low conditional, high conditional, or 200, these are arbitrary numbers. There's a linear increase in stroke risk as the velocity goes up. There's no biologic cut point, but in the United States, it's become an administrative cut point and even a legal cut point that if you have Doppler over 200 and don't provide transfusion, that can result in a malpractice obligation for physicians. And while I'm not a huge fan of lawsuits, sometimes the legal system in the United States does help enforce new guidelines that come along and makes people pay attention. So here is an example of the Doppler. You can see on the left side here, we've increased the velocity, which is the signature that we look for when we do these studies. And this is showing the lesion. So what we did with these data in 1992 was to basically go to NIH and HLBI and say, we have a tool, now let's do a clinical trial. We had a treatment which we thought was very effective, which is regular blood transfusion. That had not been tested, but had been used to prevent second and third stroke. And it looked like it would be effective, so we used it. And we did a randomized controlled clinical trial, first RCT really for stroke, in children with any condition really. And we used regular blood transfusion. Of course, they could have no history of stroke. I'm going back over this is old history, but I'm going to tell you about the foundation. They, as any clinical trial, they had to be able to take either treatment, so they had to have no indication or contraindication to transfusion, which was the experimental arm. Standard therapy, which is the occasional transfusion, that was the control arm. So, typical randomized controlled trial. We found these velocities. At that time, we did not divide conditional into two categories. All 14 sites that participated found the same thing, virtually the same distribution, with about 10% showing a high TCD over the arbitrary cut point of 200. So, the protocol was very simple: regular blood transfusion. After an induction period of frequent transfusions every week, then the children had transfusions about every month. And in those days, it was mostly simple transfusion. There were some exchange transfusions, but most of the sites did simple transfusion. And we randomized 67 in standard care, 63 in transfusion. And the study was halted when there was one stroke in the transfusion group, one minor stroke, and 11 strokes in the standard care arm. And so the Data Safety Monitoring Committee, which is set up to look at the data, said you must halt the trial and offer transfusion to all the patients. And when we did that, and here's the Kaplan-Meier, it's quite significant statistically. So what we found with a 10% risk of stroke in the untreated group per year, what this means is that the TCD delivers a population where the number needed to transfuse goes from 200 down to 10. And that's much more practical. And many people would like to reduce it further, but for reasons I will show and discuss later, that's not going to be very easy to do now because the rates of stroke are so low that new ways to select patients are going to be very difficult to validate. So it was recommended and still recommended beginning at age 2, although you'll see from the next talk that it's practical to start earlier. It's very surprising to have a stroke at age 1, but I think we've seen that occasionally. And then I certainly was very impressed early on with a family that had a couple of kids. I can remember this young girl had a stroke, or I think she was just after 2, very abnormal vascular disease. And in fact, had a fatal hemorrhage at 3.5 when she bled into this because of the moya. So it's extremely aggressive disease in some of these cases. And of course, we don't understand why that is in these cases, but that's what we need to know, and that's what the next generation here is going to, hopefully, these scientists out here are going to tell us. So there was compelling evidence of risk, but still people were reluctant to accept this because it was indefinite. So we did the second second study, and this was the STOP-2, and this was about the time I think that Ophelia, you began working with us, right? In the second study. Previously to that, there had been a scientist, Dr. Pegula, who unfortunately died. And we had many more centers, and the idea was very simple. You simply take them off transfusion after a certain period of time and see what happens. Monitor them clinically and monitor them with the TCD. And what happened here was that nothing happened in the group that continued on transfusion. They did not have any abnormal Dopplers. We had picked only the ones that had gone below 170. And we had also taken out people with abnormal MRAs, very bad MRAs. We picked a very low subset, low-risk subset. But still, even in that group, when we took away transfusion, there were 16 endpoints, 16 abnormal Dopplers, and 2 of those actually had stroke before they could get their confirmatory Doppler study. So we knew then that very quickly, you can see the Kaplan-Meier, how quickly it falls off there, that once you stop transfusion after a few months, that a substantial number of the patients develop a high-risk situation or develop stroke. So, very interesting. So, what the 2 studies taught us, pretty much where we are now, is it's very reliable. TCD is reliable, and transfusion is extremely effective. It also has a number of other benefits, which I don't have time to talk about. Most people who are in the low abnormal 200 to 230 range don't have very dramatic MRAs. Their MRAs look fairly normal. However, if they get over 240, 250, then you can expect to see abnormal MRAs. And also, they don't normalize once you go on transfusion. We did see some strokes in patients whose last MRA was normal. Some people thought that the TCD was good only to pick out who to use MRA on. And I think that what we showed in the study is that TCD is sensitive for the risk of stroke beyond the morphology changes in MRA. And this is really good because it gives us an opportunity to intervene before we get these terrible looking angiomas. So transfusion may fail, just as you saw in this example earlier, may fail in cases where there's advanced arterial disease. This came from the open label phase of the study when we had a couple of kids on transfusion with very bad disease who then had stroke after the trial had ended. We gave a lot of transfusions and we had no particular problems with them. So we did not, however, define, it was not our job to define the optimal screening strategy, so that has to be worked out. We don't really know whether the MRIs and MRAs make an independent contribution beyond TCD. Probably if we did enough of them, they probably would. We don't really know why transfusion is so effective or how it's effective and how liberal we can be with the target. That we have to drive it to below 30%, or is anything below 50 probably okay. What we did see is that in the trial, if you drifted above 30, between 30 and 45, you didn't immediately have a stroke. We saw no breakthrough strokes. It was more that being in the program of regular transfusion was what was therapeutic, not so much the instantaneous value of the hemoglobin S, if that makes sense. So, does it protect against hemorrhage? We really don't know. There weren't enough hemorrhages in the study to really tell, but it may not. And then finally, whatever is driving the stroke does not go away even after years of transfusion. Excuse me. When it's stopped, you get the high-risk state returns. So we have to keep searching for answers. So you might say, well, why would you think it would go away anyway? Why did you do stop here? Because why did you think you could take the transfusions away? Well, the answer is that at the time, people thought that perhaps the vascular disease was triggered by infection. They thought perhaps it was based on the exaggerated need for cerebral blood flow in children of an early age that then is reduced as they get older. That is, it was a developmental issue that if you got them through a certain period of transfusion, everything would be okay. Stop 2 didn't support either of those ideas, so we have to keep looking. And my view is the most important indicator of what happens after transfusion is when transfusion is an issue. What is the state of the arterial disease when it starts? What is the initial TCD? If it is close to 200, then I think your likelihood of a good outcome and the reversion TCD is very high. If it's closer to 250 or 300, and I think the highest we saw was a 330, then I think it's less clear that you're going to have a good long-term outcome. Remember that when children or anyone develops moya-moya, they have a substantial later life risk of intracranial hemorrhage. These vessels that you see on the angiogram are not normal vessels, and they can rupture quite easily. So we don't want to let moya-moya develop. So what is the earliest lesion? Well, the lesion is physiologic, not morphologic. That's why TCD works so well. It detects an abnormal flow state prior to detecting a vascular stenosis. For some reason, this fraction of patients, this 10%, go beyond the normal compensation that any child would make with a low hemoglobin, or anyone. If you have a low hemoglobin, you're going to increase your cerebral blood flow to keep oxygen delivery constant. But at some point, this becomes aberrant in this subset of patients, and the velocity starts to take off cerebral blood flow, and the velocity starts to deviate from this normal compensated level. So we need to understand why. It's a challenge to young scientists. There's something that is driving the blood flow elevation. If we can interrupt that, we might be able to stop the process very early on. I was talking with Dr. Machado earlier in the meeting about this issue of oxygen affinity. I'm not going to talk about that in great detail, but something is going on at the microvascular level. Blood flow is controlled really at the arteriolar level, not at the circular willis. So something is going on out distally that has to do with the disease, has to do with nitric oxide, we don't know, but that is what's driving the condition in terms of that. Now, you're going to get these slides, so don't worry about these, but I wanted to show one of the benefits of a clinical trial is all of the offshoots and spin-off studies, and these are just a few of these. We've actually now, with the postdoc, we've done some papers looking at our frozen samples, and we've shown that there's a lot of inflammatory indicators in our high-risk patients. And I appreciated the previous talk and the molecular biology investigation and the genetic investigations, and I think that they're certainly along the right track. The fact that they weren't more positive, I think, is an indication of the fact that it may take bigger numbers. This is a great example of the kind of work you can do when you pool your clinic patients and you pool the resources so that you have a greater power when you're looking at some of these allele frequency issues. So, is this strategy working that we looked about, which we talked about? I'll show you very quickly some of this information. We did see an early signal from California that there may be some decline. This was after the publication of the STOP studies in 1998. The Philadelphia Children's Hospital Clinic has shown very nicely that in the post-TCD period that the ischemic stroke incidence in their clinic drops dramatically. Then there are others. The French group has really done a tremendous amount of work in this regard, and they have not done randomized trials, but they've done a very systematic approach, something like what you saw that Dr. Celia presented. But they started this in 1992, not 2002. They started it right after the New England Journal paper. And they basically are very convinced that if you do the Doppler, you can use a combination of transfusion and hydroxyurea and end up with a very low stroke risk. We're still, as I'll show you, trying to sort out where hydroxyurea fits in using randomized trials. A colleague of mine and I looked at the prevalence of sickle cell disease among kids with stroke in something we call the National Inpatient Sample. That's a data bank in the United States over the whole nation. And in the post-op compared to the pre-stop era, pediatric strokes that also had sickle cell disease, that prevalence went from 8.7% of all of the kids' strokes down to less than 5%, which was significant. In contrast, sickle cell disease is playing an increased role in adults with adult stroke. More adults with stroke have sickle cell disease now than before. So the problem, as we expected, as we prevent stroke in children, we're going to accentuate the need to know more about what's happening in adults. Finally, a different set of data entirely, and this is from mortality data. We've actually shown that the disparity, the difference between the risk of dying as a child from an ischemic stroke, which is low, but it was about twice as high among black children in the United States as white children, and now it's not quite the same, but it's substantially reduced. And that is because sickle cell disease plays such a big part in the risk of stroke in black children that when we cut that, we really cut this disparity by 75%. So that's all good. It's clearly working. Do we have an alternative to red cell transfusion? Well, we are currently midway through a study called TWITCH, and it's now testing whether hydroxyurea when you transition hydroxyurea, can you substitute that for transfusion in a positive Doppler after 12 months? Transfusion 12 months or longer and switch over. We're midway through the study, and of course I run the adjudication panel. We look at all of the events. We've adjudicated a number of things, complaints, and so forth. But I don't believe we've found any strokes yet. I think this study is probably going to go on to completion, and we will know whether it's beneficial. The outcome here is actually a TCD outcome. This is the first study where there's a TCD outcome. We're actually going to look to see whether hydroxyurea maintains the TCD velocities compared to transfusion after 24 months of treatment. So we've got in primary prevention, we have the stop protocol, maybe hydroxyurea. Secondary prevention in kids is a little less well studied. This is after you have a stroke. Red cell transfusion became the norm in the 1980s. It became established without a trial, so it became impossible to do a trial because people did not have what is called equipoise. They did not have a substantial doubt anymore. And it's probably so effective that it doesn't need to be really tested anymore. And it's not so important anyway because we're going to prevent the first stroke. We're not going to need secondary prevention. Does HU test for does it work for secondary prevention? Well, we did a switch study. We participated in the switch study. And this was looking at hydroxyurea and phlebotomy as an alternative to transfusion for secondary prevention. That study has been completed. Actually not completed, it was stopped. And it was stopped early because there was a lot of activity in the hydroxyurea group, bad activity. There were 7 strokes in the hydroxyurea group and none in the transfusion group. And while it had been expected that there might be a few more strokes, there was no balancing liver gain here, so the DSMB said you better stop the study. So we have transfusion. I'm not going to talk about bone marrow transplant, but that's probably effective, particularly if you do it early enough in the disease. So I'll leave that for another talk. Now, very briefly, what about primary prevention and secondary prevention in adults? Well, as I said, these are what we call data-free zones. They're also big opportunities for young scientists that want to make an impact. The work of the pediatric people in your country as well as ours is continuing to create more survivors, thankfully, sickle cell disease. With the application of the Doppler and transfusion, more of those survivors will have no clinical stroke, and will actually have more normal brains and more normal circulation. But it's important that we maintain that. Now, Brazil, there's several of your scientists have done some work in here, so it's not completely a data-free zone. When I mean a data-free zone, I'm talking about randomized trials of treatment. We do know that the brain is under attack in adulthood for sickle cell disease. We also have some initial data from the Brazilian group, the group at São Paulo, that the TCD with a different cut point might be useful in detecting intracranial stenosis. Again, the ultimate validation of a clinical study or a test is what happens to the patient. And the very best approach, obviously, is to do randomized controlled trials where the outcome is a patient-oriented outcome and to show that you actually are preventing the disease that you're looking at. Sometimes we have to use imaging as a surrogate endpoint for studies just because that's the only practical thing that we can do. I think in adults with sickle cell disease, we just need a lot more information. So it's now reality that we've reduced the stroke in children, but these gains may be lost if we can't do some prevention in adulthood. There are important brain issues across the entire spectrum. They have a lot of problems. So-called neurologically intact adults with sickle cell disease do not score on neuropsych testing as well as their peers, even if we don't see anything on the MRI. And if we do see something on the MRI, it's even worse. Now, possibly the MRI techniques may get better to show subtle injury to the brain from sickle cell disease that we can't now see. Whatever it is, we have to imagine that it's been going on a while, since this disease starts very early in life. And we have to be very aggressive all throughout the age cycle. This is from data from imaging and neuropsych testing. So finally, I want to just say a few things about what I have learned of this and what I want to impart and have a discussion about. So it's very important that research be planned for the long term. So it took 12 years from the beginning, when we started the TCD, to the publication of the clinical trial in 1998. I had much more hair in 1998 than in 2002. I was young, and the point is you have to take the long view. There are no shortcuts in this business. So here's something for those of you that don't do this every day. Here's the hierarchy of clinical research. It starts off with case reports. Then you go to retrospective chart reviews, which are looking at the prevalent cases that you have. And then it advances to prospective cohort studies. And in cohort studies, you can look at the incident cases, as well as follow the progress of the prevalent cases to see if they have further problems. And then eventually, when you have a good enough idea of what you're dealing with, you move to the randomized controlled clinical trials. And these are the tests, typically tests of treatment. They can also be tests of diagnosis, but typically it's tests of treatment. Now these are followed by something called phase 4 or open label studies that provide useful information. In phase 4, and typically this is typical language from our FDA, after you introduce a drug into use, you no longer can obtain any information about its effectiveness, can you? Because you no longer have a control group. What you can do in phase 4 is you look for unexpected side effects. Those you can pick up in phase 4. Complications in phase 4 can be detected that you didn't see in the phase 3 clinical trials. But you can't make new inferences about effectiveness because you've stopped the control group and you've given them all the drug. That's what open label means. So it's really important to have a research pipeline and a long-range perspective on this. So, good, compassionate clinical care is important to change the outcome of the individual patient. And good clinical research is important to improve the outcome of an entire group of patients. And RCTs really still give us, randomized controlled trials still give us the most valuable data. I'm really impressed with the enthusiasm and the opportunities here in Brazil for contributing substantially to some of these questions. There seems to be a cooperative environment among at least 3 of the centers that I'm familiar with, and perhaps more. There seems to be more continuity in the care of patients between the adults and the children and the adults, which is good. We seem to have young researchers and potential researchers here at the meetings and people who are interested. And it's very, very clear that human resources are really the key here, and it's primarily attracting young scientists and keeping them, young clinicians and scientists, and keeping them from becoming derailed or discouraged in the process of developing research ideas. And that means finding monetary and grant support for them. Some ideas that might be thought about: long-term follow-up of all the TCD positive cases that you've detected in Brazil since screening started. A chart review of all of the neurologic cases with adults in sickle cell disease from your 3 centers to estimate some rates. Perhaps a prospective cohort study of all the adults that, as they graduate the TCD screening domain, which is 16 to 18 years of age, look at them all with TCD, PRV, maybe GFR, etc., and do a clinical follow-up. Participate with the United States and other countries in research in hydroxyurea and otherwise, and keep your eye on something that we sometimes lose sight of in the United States, which is that large, simple trials of adjunctive therapy can be valuable and should be considered. Large, simple trials are something that the Europeans talk a lot about. We tend to create these smaller, targeted, very highly intensive clinical trials. They're very hard to do and hard to reproduce in the community afterwards. So we need to think about what is the best, what are things that we can test that are going to translate well into areas, and especially low resource areas. And this would be a couple of things that I would suggest specifically maybe to talk about. If you form a close international collaborative that could negotiate as a group with NIH and with NIH-funded researchers to enhance Brazilian participation in RCTs, that would be good for you and good for the studies because it would increase enrollment. One of the problems with getting funding from NIH and then enrolling sites or using sites that are in other countries is simply the bureaucracy. It can be done. Not a problem with NIH money supporting sites in Brazil. It's just the bureaucracy. So if you had a single negotiating point that said, here, we're going to work with you, we have to organize everything, and we will handle everything in Brazil, I think you would find an extremely interested group of NIH-funded researchers for the next generation of studies. And I think that would be extremely important for you to consider. You have to look at your research infrastructure. You have to assess what you have now, and you have to look and see what you need in the future. The research infrastructure is crucial. It's not just the people who are interested, it's the process for training them, it's the coordinators, it's the consent process, and it's the follow-up. How do you do all of this in your environment? The cutting edge of science is important to advance our knowledge, but it's the simple, widely applicable tests and treatments that have the biggest clinical impact, especially for sickle cell disease in countries that are not as advanced as Brazil, the United States, in Africa. So we have to keep that in mind. I'll say that when I started this, my first trial, my first NIH-funded study was in '98. We were looking at TCD and MRI, which had just come out at the time, and most of us thought the MRI was going to be much better than the humble, simple old TCD. But it turned out that the TCD was far more effective because it could be widely used, it could be applied to many kids in many more locations, it could be applied frequently. Certainly there's a role for MRI, but when we think about what we can apply to large groups of people in a practical way, we have to keep that in mind. So, one of the things I've been advancing in the United States is the idea of the Ronald Reagan implant. Those of